Imagine it is a Saturday morning in Britain in 1952. A man stands in his driveway staring at a car he saved 2 years to buy. His wife is at the window. His children are pressing their faces to the glass. This was the moment the 1950s promised every ordinary British family. The car arrived, and with it, the feeling that the hard years really were behind them. Britain was rebuilding. The roads were filling up. And the motor industry knew it had millions of hopeful first-time buyers with very little to compare. Most manufacturers did their best. But some took liberties, and some sent those families out onto Britain's wet roads in machines that broke their hearts as quickly as they had lifted them. These are the 10 worst British family cars of the 1950s. And number 1 is almost impossible to believe. If this kind of honest British history speaks to you, do stay with us and consider subscribing. 10. The Austin A40 Somerset, the car that arrived looking old. When the Austin A40 Somerset reached showrooms in 1952, the response was polite rather than excited. Autocar magazine tested one that April and recorded a 0 to 60 time of 36.6 seconds, genuinely sluggish even by early 1950s standards. The Somerset's 1.2-litre engine produced just 42 horsepower, and a full family load made every incline a struggle. But the deeper problem was not performance, it was ambition. Austin had taken the running gear from the A40 Devon, dating to 1947, reskinned it in a style borrowed from the larger A70 Hereford, and presented the result as something new. Honest John Classics noted plainly that Austin was offering running gear already antiquated at a moment when the Morris Minor was showing what modern engineering could do for families. Over 173,000 Somersets were sold before replacement in 1954, but that tells you more about post-war hunger than it does about the Somerset's merits. The man in the driveway deserved something from his decade, and Austin handed him something from the one before. 9. The Jowett Javelin, the brilliant car that broke its own promise. The Jowett Javelin from Idle, near Bradford, was on paper everything a forward-thinking British family should have wanted. Designer Gerald Palmer gave it aerodynamic styling, torsion bar suspension, and a flat-4 engine when most British rivals still offered pre-war thinking. The Motor magazine declared it unrivaled in its class. But from late 1951, Jowett began fitting their own in-house gearboxes after a supplier contract ended, and those gearboxes were not ready. Of the first 1,000 cars fitted with a new transmission, 78 suffered failures, as documented in contemporary reports. The engine was prone to crankshaft breakages and head gasket failures, with at least 18 significant engineering modifications issued across its production life, evidenced in the company's own surviving service bulletins. Production ceased in 1953. Families who had believed in what Bradford could build were left managing a car whose maker had vanished, and that is a particular loneliness no enthusiast review had ever warned them about. 8. The Vauxhall Wyvern EIX, performance that never arrived. The Vauxhall Wyvern of the early 1950s had clean modern bodywork and the confidence of General Motors ownership behind it. But the Wyvern's 1,508 cubic centimeters four-cylinder engine was, as Vauxhall's own documented internal history acknowledges, an old unit delivering performance pitiful even by contemporary standards. The side-opening bonnet suffered from hinge corrosion severe enough that Vauxhall changed to a conventional rear-mounted hinge in 1953 specifically because of failures in earlier production cars. On any fully loaded family run, luggage, children, along a road, the Wyvern communicated its limitations clearly and often. It was the kind of car that made you arrive grateful rather than happy, and in a decade built on rising expectations, that was not a small distinction. 7. The Standard 8, ambition stripped to the bone. Standard launched the 8 in 1953 at one of the lowest prices of any new car in Britain. That price came with costs the brochure did not mention. The earliest Standard 8s had no exterior door handles on the rear doors. Backseat passengers had to wait for someone in front to release them. There was no heater fitted as standard. The rear window offered almost no rearward visibility, and the 803 cubic centimeters engine strained on any reasonable hill. Standard improved the 8 steadily, and by the mid-50s it was a far more reasonable car. But those first 1953 buyers, the ones who had saved carefully and arrived full of hope, discovered that the price in pounds was not the only cost Standard had asked, and the quiet sense of having been given the minimum was not one that faded easily. 6. The Hillman Minx Phase 4, when the lights went out. The Hillman Minx was one of the most familiar names on 1950s British driveways. Sensible, trusted, middle of the road in the best sense. But the Phase 4, produced between 1951 and 1952, developed a persistent reputation for electrical problems that went beyond the general frustration with Lucas components characterizing the era. Owner reports accumulated of headlights flickering without warning, starting failures on cold mornings, and wiring that occasionally gave up entirely. For a family depending on one car to reach the factory gate at 6 in the morning, or collect children in November's dark, those failures were not inconvenient, they were genuinely distressing. The Minx recovered strongly with later versions. But the Phase 4 earned a quietly bitter reputation in the streets and driveways of a decade that simply could not afford a car that would not start. 5. The Austin A70 Hereford, the car that looked bigger than it felt. The Austin A70 Hereford presented itself as a substantial step up from the smaller Austins below it. Families who stretched their budgets found what classic and sports car described in their period comparison as a car built for a conservative market rather than one keeping pace with the decade's rising expectations. The A70 used a 2.2-litre four-cylinder engine delivering adequate rather than confident performance, and the body-on-frame construction Austin retained long after rivals had moved to unibody designs made the Hereford feel heavier and older than it needed to be. Perhaps you remember a car like this, a large, slow saloon that took 3 attempts on a February morning. If you do, leave a memory in the comments. We would genuinely love to hear it. The Hereford was not a bad car. It simply asked a great deal and gave back just enough. And in a decade of rising hopes, that quiet shortfall was its most enduring quality. 4. The Vauxhall Victor F-Type, the glamour that rusted. The Victor arrived in 1957 looking unlike anything else on a British street. Fins, wraparound windscreen, heavy chrome bumpers. Families queued. But as Haggerty UK's documented history of flawed British cars records, the Victor's body was designed under an extremely tight schedule after General Motors in Detroit insisted on American-inspired styling, overwhelming Luton's production engineers. Water crept through the seals around the wraparound screens. The thin body panels rusted with alarming speed. Vauxhall's reputation for rust-prone models, which would follow the brand into the 1960s, began with this car. Families who had felt something close to pride on the morning they collected their Victor found themselves 2 winters later looking at bubbling paint along the sills, wondering where the promise had gone. 3. The Standard Vanguard Phase 1, the post-war optimist that rusted quietly. The Standard Vanguard arrived in British homes from 1950 carrying enormous confidence. A 2,088 cubic centimeters overhead valve engine, bench seating for 6, and a top speed around 80 miles per hour confirmed in Motorsport magazine's 1954 road test. It felt modern and worthy. But the Standard Motor Club's own published buyer's guide is candid about what time revealed. Vanguard bodyshells can rot badly, with chassis outriggers, outer and inner sills, rear arches, and floors all subject to serious corrosion. These vulnerabilities were not mysteries that appeared only decades later. The steel and its protection were simply not equal to British winters. Families who kept their Vanguards through the wet early 50s learned this slowly and expensively, panel by panel, until the car bought with such pride became the car kept going out of sheer stubbornness. 2. The Hillman Husky, the estate that unsettled everything. The Hillman Husky arrived in 1954 as a practical short-wheelbase estate version of the Minx, exactly the versatile family vehicle that 1950s Britain was beginning to need. It could carry luggage, children, the weekly shop, and still get everyone home. But the short wheelbase that gave it a useful loading floor also gave it handling that period road testers noted with concern. The high roofline and short rear created a vehicle noticeably unsettled at speed, prone to wallowing on fast roads in a way that made passengers reach for something solid. The Minx engine was not suited to the extra weight the estate encouraged owners to load aboard. Families who bought the Husky because they needed something useful discovered that useful and confidence-inspiring were very different promises, and that on a fast dual carriageway, the car that carried everything could make you feel you were the one carrying it. 1. The Ford Anglia 100e, the decade's most beloved disappointment. And here is the one that will surprise you. The Ford Anglia 100e, sold from 1953 to 1959, was among the best-selling British family cars of the entire decade. Hundreds of thousands of families drove one, or grew up in the back of one. And yet beneath its charming shape, the 100e was built from deliberate compromise at every point. Its side-valve engine, dating in its essentials to the 1930s, produced around 36 horsepower and a top speed of approximately 70 miles per hour, already surpassed by rivals with modern overhead valve units. Ford kept the side valve specifically to hold manufacturing costs down, and British families paid that difference every time they needed to overtake on a main road. The gearbox had no synchromesh on first gear. The heater was an optional extra. Britain bought the Anglia because there was enormous hunger for anything affordable, and Ford understood that hunger precisely. The 100e is number one not because it was the worst built car here, but because it succeeded so thoroughly while offering so little. And that gap is the truest measure of what the British motor industry still owed the families who trusted it. Britain in the 1950s was a nation in a hurry to move forward, and its motor industry was part of that movement. sometimes leading it, sometimes failing it. Every car on this list was bought by a real family, on a real street, in a real moment of hope. Someone's father came home with the keys. Someone's mother learned to drive in it. Children fell asleep on back seats smelling of vinyl on long summer journeys. The cars were imperfect, the industry was imperfect, and the families who trusted them deserve more credit than history gives them. If one of these cars featured in your own story, the model, the cold morning it failed, the journey it somehow completed, leave it in the comments. We genuinely want to hear it. A like and a subscribe means the world to us, and there are many more stories from these remarkable decades still to tell.